Classes in Game Design, based on the books by George Phillies and Tom Vasel, Design Elements of Contemporary Strategy Games, and Contemporary Perspectives in Game Design, both from Third Millennium Publications, http3mpub.com/Phillies. And today, this lecture is Lecture 15, Game Design. What I am going to do today is to discuss mechanisms in game design. We did this on the exam, and your lists of mechanisms were a tad bit short in many cases. And some of you came up with some very clever mechanisms. There really are mechanisms that I hadn't thought of myself. So what I'm going to do is to go through basically an alphabetical list of mechanisms, things that are rules in some sense. And it's an enhanced list relative to anything we've talked about before. Questions before we launch? Good. So we will start out. And we could start off with area control. And area control can be straightforward, the way it is in Monopoly or Risk. There are identifiable geographic areas, and you grab it. There are other sorts of areas, though. If you are competing biotech firms, the game is called Patential. You can imagine a competing biotech game in which the areas you control are biomedical processes of some sort. And patent area control is, a major part of how companies get rich by paying attorneys. Bidding. There are all sorts of bidding processes out there. There are open bids where I stand here holding up the item being auctioned off, and people hold up paddles and I call numbers. There are sealed single round bids. There are Dutch auctions. The notion of a Dutch auction is you bid. And I am selling, say, 13 typewriters. God knows why anyone would want typewriters anymore. And there are 37 bids. The top 13 win, but the top 13 go for the price of the lowest winning bid. So you are willing to pay more, but you don't have to pay more than the lowest winning bid. Bribe, referee, or bribe games master. It's been done, and there are various sorts of, guess who showed up with the games master, a box of the games master's favorite candy, and somewhat more direct methods, but you get the idea. Business / trade / purchasing / selling. And the notion here is you have commodities or manufactured output of some sort, and lying behind this, most typically, though you could proceed by barter, is something which is a universal value, money. The virtue of money is that it's immediately exchangeable for whatever you want. Everyone more or less agrees on its value, so that if you are attempting to figure out, well, I want 3,000 yards of steel pipe, 3-inch diameter, and I want to sell 50 tons of aluminum oxide, and someone else wants to purchase acetylene and aluminum oxide, and they want to sell ethylene, and suddenly we have all of these exchanges going on. The virtue of money is that everyone can understand what they're doing and figure out whether they're covering costs or not. The opposite of this, which I am old enough to remember, is when you decide you will have price controls and something's actual reasonable price gets too large for the price control, and suddenly what actually happened was that all of the chemical companies in the country discovered that if they wanted large diameter pipe, they could not pay money for it. They had to give a share of the profits from the plant. This is the front end just before your economy implodes. It got fixed in time. Okay, what else can we describe as a mechanism? Catch-up. What is catch-up? Well, I will give an example from Conquest, based on Conquest of the Fallen Lands. Everyone counts how much money they have at the start of the turn. Whoever has the least money goes first. Whoever has the next least money goes second, and so on down the line. You could do the same thing in Monopoly, couldn't you? You have a different turn order each time, and the turn order is constructed in such a way that it tries to even the game out. Of course, if you're clever, you figure out how to game that mechanism. Let's see. Capture, as seen in checkers, is a form of combat. How about common enemy? The simplest common enemy was the one you saw on Vanished Planet. All of the players are up against one AI. Well, it wasn't a very bright AI. It just pushed a piece out whenever it was allowed to. And everyone is on the same side. There have, however, inspired by Star Wars, been a number of space warfare games in which all of the players except one were running their individual local republics, empires, and so on and so forth. And one player was the evil supreme overlord of the universe who had a much bigger empire than everyone else, but the minor disadvantage that everyone else was on the other side. That's common enemy. Combat resolution. Capture is the simplest imaginable combat resolution. Namely, you move, yes, and the piece you attacked dies. But you can have more elaborate schemes like Risk, in which you roll dice. You can have board war game schemes. We'll be talking about board war game schemes in a bit. And in the board war game schemes, there can be fairly elaborate numerical calculations to get you to a result. Combat resolution. Cooperation / alliance. The notion of cooperation and alliance is, if you have a multiplayer game, you can form groups to beat up on people on the other side. This does not always work uniformly well. One of the traditional difficulties is in designing a 3-player war game with 3 sides. If the 3 sides are about even in strength and have no other constraints on what they do, 2 will usually gang up on the 3rd and wipe them out, and this does not lead to a very good game. If you get to a larger number of players, like 6 or 9, suddenly things become more stable because the alliances are more evenly matched. The disadvantage of a 9-player board game is you have to find 9 players. That's a problem. Okay, cooperation and diplomacy. Economics. I might as well do all 3. Economic growth, economic development, the notion in economics is that you are doing buying, selling, trading, manufacturing, and you are either representing something that's multi-level, so there are various processes that have to be balanced against each other. The opposite of that would be in Puerto Rico, where you managed to build 12 plantations and had neglected to build a single processing plant. That's unbalanced. That's a bad tactical decision. In economic growth, which in a sense is represented in Puerto Rico, among other places, as you go on, you have facilities that make things, and you can expand their capacity by building more. Economic development has a feature which you may view either as a feature or a disadvantage, and the feature or disadvantage is exponential growth. If you don't put any constraints on things, on turn 20 you're sending out battle fleets of 100 starships. On turn 30 it's 1,000 starships. On turn 40 it's 10,000 starships, and eventually you get something totally huge. Or more likely, eventually the computer memory croaks. Okay, economic development is the more sophisticated version of this, in which you have a tech tree, and in addition to saying, well, we are going to build sawmills using classical up and down saw blades, at some point you can access, it was a great American invention, the circular saw. It was invented by the Shakers, which were an American religious movement which has died out, almost. But it's an enormous labor-saving tool because you have a water wheel that's turning, it makes the saw turn, and it's incredibly more efficient than the sawmills you can see at Old Sturbridge Village. Okay, that's economic development. Exploration, where you have incomplete data on what the map is, typically the map, and you have to fill it in. There is also often exploration in tech trees. That is, you have a tech tree, but you do not actually know what is there, well, until you've played it a few times. Now, you could do a more sophisticated version of this, in which you have a tech tree, and the tech tree is partially randomly generated. For example, it's a World War II war game, and you throw large amounts of resources into atomic weapons, which were greatly overrated in World War II. And the atomic weapons you discover cannot be made to go up. And all of those resources that could have gone into something useful has instead gone into making large amounts of useless radioactive waste. Okay, that's exploration of a tech tree. Okay, end game. And there are stacks of conditions for terminating a game. That is, unless the game is supposed to go on forever, something is supposed to happen. There are games that go on forever. There are people who develop these massively multi-parallel games, and as necessary add more continents, rules to keep groups from taking off, and so on and so forth. And the game could go on forever. There's no end condition. Original Dungeons and Dragons were like that. There's nothing that stops you. Graining. I'll do Conquest again as an illustration of graining. The graining was that if you had enough force, you could attack the other side, and if you knew what you were counting right, you would for sure win. You could also imagine we will have the force, and each side gets a number of risk armies that is equal to its attack value, and the other side defender gets a number of defense armies equal to the defense factor, and you stand there rolling dice. You could do higher complexity, where you play it out as miniatures battles on a small or large, I suggest not the airship hangar scale, and that is finer grain. There's more detail there. Okay? Kriegspiel. And I will drop in here hidden movement, which is not quite the same thing. The notion in Kriegspiel is that you are going to have some event. You provide a statement, it's from the German, because this was originally done for battles. And so two sides march in waving flags, and there's cavalry and infantry, or two sides attempt to drill holes in a mountain for their railroad features, and you have an expert who knows what's going on, who sits there and looks and tells you how long it will take to cut the tunnel, or which side will win the battle and what the casualties will be, and you have an expert running things. Now that can be very good, assuming you have an expert who everyone respects. This works fine with games masters where everyone is on one side. It works less well if you have two sides and you have to worry about the impartiality of the referees. There are several interesting historical examples. The Austro-Prussian War, an Austrian referee would have assured his side that the bayonet ruled, and you launched charges in column against people with rifled muskets. The American Civil War several years earlier had already shown that this approach was sort of like suicide, except much more expensive. The referee, you have a referee, doesn't mean he's a good referee. Hidden movement just means the units are sweeping across the map, but you have a fog of war. You only see something like what your own forces would see, and you don't see where much of the enemy is. It can be a very attractive thing. It can be computer implemented much easier than it could be implemented the way it was when I was sort of your age with human referees. But that's Kriegspiel. Okay. Movement. You often have things that do not stay put. There are very good games with no movement. Go, for example. Conquer the Internet. But there are games with movement, and there are very large numbers of movement rules you can imagine implementing. Oh, counter orientation. So, it's a game based on squares. It's Napoleonic warfare. Here is the unit in line advancing, and if it is attacked by someone this way, or from the perspective of its officers, God forbid, attacked from the back, the effect of the attack is dramatically different than if it is attacked from the front. And if it is attacked from several at the same time, things get even worse. Related to this slightly is what we would call synergy. That is, if you have actors that are doing something, that's very nebulous, actors that are doing something, it may be that having a group of actors, not necessarily human actors, that have different skill sets or different whatever, if you deploy them at the same time, their effectiveness is much larger than if you just had one of them at a time. The traditional military example is called combined arms. The opposite of combined arms is, oh, we'll have a tank division with nothing but tanks in it and no infantry. And then you go into a city and discover, as is still true, a tank by itself in a city, unless you have very good tanks and a very weak defense, as you saw in Iraq, is basically a coffin to which treads have temporarily been attached. Useful lesson here. Okay, synergy. Let's push on with mechanisms. Hopefully I will run out of mechanisms at about the same time I run out of time. Okay, let's see. Play order. What order do the players act? Play sequence. Who does what first? You saw the difference very dramatically in Puerto Rico, where there's the first player to grab a roll, the second player to grab a roll, and in the next round it's a different group of players. There is also play sequence in which you do different things during your turn. However, you can play lots of games, so for example, it's not necessarily one player does everything, the other player does everything. Life could be more complicated. Point-based, customizable, you have a group of explorers or warships or box stores you're building or whatever, and you have a certain number of points, money for example, you can expend on deploying them. And you can choose how you go about doing this. And as you go about doing it in different ways, instead of having everyone starts with 3 ships and 2 box stores, you can choose what you want to buy for yourself. The original Dungeons and Dragons, you rolled dice for starting characters. The alternative is I give you 30 points, which you can distribute among your abilities within certain limits as you see fit. You notice I've now added a variation to the game. Okay. Restricted actions. You would love to do everything at once. If you're a chess player, you would love to be able to move all 16 of your pieces. But you should consider your opponent gets to do the same, and the results may be very dramatic very fast. Okay. That abomination, real time. And while people typically talk about real time in terms of computer games where your character is chugging along and must respond fairly quickly, this is better if you have good twitch reflexes than if you don't. There is also, we brought up chess, yes. Chess is a real-time game and competitive play. There are these things called chess clocks, and they are clicking away. There is one notorious, famous case. It was a 3-hour game, and I think it was Judith Polgar, world's best female chess player. And suddenly, she burns close to 2 hours of her time on one move, except it was burned very effectively because the opponent was wiped out very quickly thereafter. I may misremember who it was. Setup. All of the games you talked about today had setups. Usually you start on a single square. It doesn't have to be like that. It's perfectly what you propose. That's a great way to go. It's a very traditional way to go for an exploration game. There are other ways of doing things. You could start at several places. You could say, we've deployed the map. It's an exploration game. The map is deployed, but you don't know what's on any of the squares other than vaguely there's a river here. That's setup and then exploration. But setup, you have several choices on how you do things. Role-playing, several variations here. One, you get different functions you perform during a turn, and in some sense you're playing each of those roles. There are also games like Talisman where you choose a role for the game, and each role has minor advantages or disadvantages. If the advantages are major, it starts to get much harder to balance the game. Risk, reward, players can put down things or not, and the outcome, the reward, is proportionate to how much you invest, but so is what you are hazarding. A traditional American game with this feature is called poker. And there, at some point, you either say, I'm putting all my money down, or you don't. And things happen, or they don't. Never liked poker, sorry. Randomization. You are exploring, you draw tiles. You are exploring a star map. You can see where the stars are in advance. And you roll dice to discover what's at the far end. You have a competition of some sort, and you roll dice or draw cards to see what the outcome is. Randomization. Resources, which may be limited, meaning there's only so much material out there. I said role-playing, there's also role selection, seen in many role-playing games. You get to choose what type of character you have. Slippery slope. I didn't exactly discuss this one before, though I've hinted at it. And the notion is you have a game. Progress game is a good example. Everyone must march through the same number of turns to the end. But one player gets a minor incremental advantage. And once they have that minor incremental advantage, it can get fairly respectably difficult to dislodge them from it because the incremental advantage lets them buy further advantages. This can be a very negative game feature because we are on turn 5 of a 50-turn game. I have a 1 square lead, which lets me get to all of the resources first. I think you can see where this is going. And the rest of you are going to have to suffer 45 more turns of me gloating. You wouldn't like that. Special event. Draw a card every turn. Most of them are inert, except of course for the one you carefully put in, which says, minefield. Lead player kindly finds it for you and is knocked back 3 spaces. That's a special event. We don't want that one. Status markers. Sliders. The Carcassonne scoring thing is a sort of an example of a slider, except you're just shoving the token around. Tokens. Things that record what is going on. Monopoly money. In principle, all of these are simply replacements for human memory with one exception. Oh, I forgot, I had another $100,000 under that box. Well, human memory is sometimes fallible, especially if it gives you an advantage to forget. Tokens do not forget. Okay, we're actually, you notice these were sort of alphabetical, and we are somewhat reaching the end of the alphabet. I do not believe this is a complete list. However, we could mention stochastic events, things where the outcome is not certain. Risk combat, the outcome is not certain. Stalingrad combat against the notorious or illustrious Scott Wurzer, who would make what ought to have been extremely dangerous attacks, but he had incredible luck even if you were rolling his dice for him. Stochastic events, the outcome is not certain. And then, tech trees. Don't have to explain that one, except some tech trees are not really technology, and the folks doing the evolution game sound as though they found a very clever thing. It's not a tech tree, but it really is. Okay, what else do we have? Trade, players. I mentioned business and economics, and you can do something where you actually have markets and the players can constructively interact with each other in a non-zero-sum manner. Okay, trick-taking. Whist is a card game, but I mentioned it's in design elements. The board war game where you win by taking tricks on different parts of the, or constructing tricks on different parts of the battlefield. Very clever use of important mechanism for game design, combination. Taking mechanisms that are only usually used in one place and putting them in someplace else. Victory conditions. I shall skip the manufacturer, though they're out of business, of the board war game in which in the very first edition the first side moved. Careful analysis showed that the first side had satisfied the victory conditions and won the game. And it wasn't even the other side's move yet. The chessie's equivalent is, you see the starting position, and the puzzle is white to move and mate in one. That wouldn't be a very good game at all, except for white. Victory points. You've seen money used for scoring, but you can do more complicated things. Carcassonne was an example of that. You can do various different things that are worth different numbers of victory points, but if you have qualitatively different objects and you want to know who won, you have to have some way of combining all of them. And victory points do that. Victory points are usually additive, but if you look carefully through design elements, you can find a game in which you are playing things on a matrix, and one of the math elements involved is a multiplication. And thus, suddenly, certain moves are a little more valuable. They're 3 times as valuable. I thought that was a very clever scheme. Let's see, what have I forgotten? Okay, I think I didn't say starting. Special rules that only apply on the first turn. Anyone see a mechanism I missed? I'm sure there are some. We have done mechanisms. I have managed to run us almost exactly out of time. Sometimes you get lucky on these things. I will see you all tomorrow. Class dismissed.